Hello, this is Chris Gregory calling.
Thanks a lot for calling in. So I was just going to start with you just giving your background on how you got involved in the Vietnam War and why you got involved in philosophy afterwards.
Sure. In 1964, actually 1963, the end of 1963, I found myself a 17-year-old boy in suburban New Jersey, quite unhappy and unproductive, and I decided to skip high school and join the service. I went down and signed up, and in April they took me. I signed up for the Air Force for 4 years. Vietnam was not a there was some advisors stationed there, but there was I don't think there'd been casualties of any kind, and I didn't really know anything about it. Kennedy had given a speech on the subject, but he actually was killed in November, and he gave a speech sometime in the fall before he was killed, or summer before he was killed. And I joined up in December, so Vietnam was not on my mind when I joined. I became an Air Force medic. They trained me to be a medic, and I worked in hospitals, and then I went worked in a hospital in Florida, and then I was selected to become a air evacuation medic, which was better pay and quicker promotions. And so I took that. I went to get retrained for that, and Vietnam, this was 1966, and things were starting to heat up a bit. And so in 1967, I was sent to Vietnam as a air evacuation medic. I had been jockeying patients in airplanes all over the United States for a year or so, a year and a half before that, and this was very well familiar with the injuries that people were coming back with. So at the time of the Tet Offensive, just prior to the Tet Offensive, I got word that I had to go further west until I got to Vietnam, because there was so many casualties being evacuated that everybody had to move closer to the engagement. So that's what I did. I worked on large planes, C-141s, which could carry as many as 250 patients at a time. Half were in leaders lying down, in stretchers, and half were sitting up. So I took them various places, from various spots in Vietnam to various other places, from Cam Bay, Tan Son Nhut, and Da Nang, to the Philippines, to Hawaii, to Alaska, to Japan, for 6 months or 4 months or so. I rarely spent more than a few days in Vietnam prior to my being shipped out with another load of patients. So my time there was time in Vietnam was not my experience in Vietnam was not, I don't think, the standard experience of being in danger, being in combat, but I did see some tracers, and I was frightened at times, but I was never in danger that would be equivalent to someone in active combat. My experience was the trauma of these fellows who I had to take care of while they were being transported. And some of the injuries, especially when the Tet Offensive was going full blast, were acute injuries. They had still, you could still smell gunpowder, and they still had their uniforms on, even though they had lost a limb, or they had a bullet in them, or they had been burned or something. They had been triaged, but they hadn't really and stabilized, but they were still quite hurt, and these injuries were fresh. So I saw a lot of that, and I saw some people who were very, very badly hurt. And I spent a lot of time going back and forth, and the transit gives you a lot of time to think. And when we went over on these 141s, we went to Vietnam. Sometimes we went commercial airlines. More often, we went on the 141s. They would be stacked full of coffins, and we'd take the coffins over and bring the soldiers back. We didn't bring coffins; came on another plane that was exclusively for coffins. So, I saw just a lot of badly hurt fellows for a long time. Boys, really. Most of the people who were hurt were between 17 and 24, like young men, boys. And it affected me more than I realized. I mean, I was a professional, so I was trained to treat these fellows, and that's what I did. And I didn't think about the implications I certainly didn't think about the moral implications. I thought about the implications of did they have enough fluids in them? Were they gonna get sicker on my watch, or was I going to be able to get them to where they needed to go safely and in one piece? And so that was my focus, and I became pretty good at it. But later, when I got out of the service, I decided I was not done with intellectual pursuits, and I managed to get myself accepted to Brandeis University, which had a terrific philosophy department at the time.
So you were a high school graduate. You were a high school graduate when you?
No, I dropped out of high school. I got a GED in Mississippi when I was stationed there for a few months.
How about your family in New Jersey? Were you from an educated background, or?
Yes, my father was a lawyer.
Oh, that's
my mother
good.
was high school, but I was, I was from an educated background, and my parents had ambitions, but I had intellectual ambitions of my own. From a kid, I like to read, voracious reader, always from a kid, and subscribed to a lot of periodicals, read a lot of books, and so I had, I suppose you call them pretensions to be an intellectual, intellectual pretensions that I wanted to try to live up to and realize, So I somehow got myself into Brandeis. I had to take a bunch of courses, and I had to get myself so I could actually participate as a student, which was not easy. I found I couldn't really write a paragraph when I had not, I'd been 4 years in Vietnam and was not a student prior to that. I mean, I was a terrible high school student, very rebellious for a variety of reasons, extremely, profoundly rebellious, and almost to a point that I can't imagine raising a kid like me. Having raised 4 sons myself, I think, God, I would have driven myself crazy, or I would have killed myself. The father would have killed the son, and the son would have driven father crazy. In any event, it wouldn't have been a happy situation. But what I put my father through was brutal. Anyway, but he paid for me to go to Brandeis, and he was very, very happy that I went. So the tuition was $6,000, and I managed to live. I had a job, and I managed to pay my own, maintenance. So anyway, so when I got to Brandeis, I had to really immerse myself in study, and because I was not effective, I wasn't like a kid that just got through a decent high school and as well, I had a lot of trouble relaxing. I couldn't, your brain doesn't work well when you're stressed. It doesn't function as well as it should, and so I very fortunately, Brandeis at that time was filled with a lot of, so this is 1968. It was filled with Eastern European intellectuals who had gone through God only knows what kind of horrors. I mean, they dominated the campus life. People who had been through pogroms and all sorts of trouble in their native country. Philip Robb was on the faculty. He was a literary fellow, and there was a bunch of other people who had terrible trouble in Second World War and were real, genuine intellectuals. I mean, life of the mind was what they were doing, and nothing else. And so I think one of them, a guy named Leon Edel, I had for an English teacher, and he said, "No, you just came back from Vietnam. Don't worry about it. You'll be fine. I think you're probably going to be a college professor. You get a B. Just relax and try to read this thing again. Make sure you just calm down. You'll be fine." And so they were very patient, great. And that kind of reassurance is so valuable. And it allowed me to stay there. And so for a couple of years, I didn't do anything but study, try to get the basics of being able to, read for content and be able to, expound a theory on a paper. It's a harder thing to do than you realize. If you can't do it and you try to if you haven't been trained to do it and you try to accrue that at 22, it's harder to do than you might think, or at least it was hard for me. It'd probably be easier for you, but it was hard for me. So but in the course of that, I was working, and I was working in a Waltham hospital as a medic, which is something I was well trained to do. And but they quickly figured out that they didn't care what I would. I was not shrinking violet. If I gave all the pre-op enemas, I gave cleaned up after all the autopsies. I did a lot of the surgery preparation, and I assisted at some other autopsies, but and it was quite, when I think about it now, I think, God, anyway, I was trying to write a paper, an ontology paper, and I couldn't do it. I came back from work at 11 o'clock at night, and I tried to sit down and write this ontology paper, and my brother was visiting me. I said, "Gee, this just is not coming. I just can't figure this out." And he said, "You got to quit that job. You can't do that kind of thing and then sit down and write a paper on it. It just doesn't make any sense. You can't." Ultimately, I did quit the job, and I started to think about other things. I miss the fellowship of the other veterans very much. I had no contemporaries at Brandeis University. There were plenty of nice people there, nice professors and gracious students, but nobody was anything like me, and there was no one I could talk to, and I missed a great deal. The fellowship of soldiers, of guys my age who had been through my experience. So I found a group in Cambridge that was doing discharge surveys or discharge improvements and counseling for people who wanted to get conscientious observer status. By this time, I had thought a lot about the fellows I'd helped and about the war itself, and I thought it was an extremely wasteful thing, and it was extremely unfortunate for the guys who were hurt. And so I was working there, and the guy, Jerry Grossman, was a fellow who was a liberal line. He was a Democratic National Committee man, and he was given some support to this organization that was working with these veterans. We had a newspaper out at Fort Devens in Ayer, and that newspaper was a daily paper that reported on who was going to where and what was going on in Vietnam and what was going on the base. And it wasn't daily every day, but when it came out, it was for that day. And it came out 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes every day for a few days. And it was a drop, some guys would drop it around the base. And so I started talking to those fellows, and becoming, my attitudes about the war were being shaped by other experiences. And so then a fellow Grossman asked me and another couple of guys to meet John Kerry, who wanted to start a chapter of Vietnam Veterans Against the War in Massachusetts, where he'd been working in New York for a year or so. And we said, no thanks, we really don't want to meet him. But Grossman said, well, I'll buy you lunch. So I said, yeah, okay, well, we'd love to meet him. Under that.
Free food.
right. So we did meet him, and we were very impressed with him. I got to say, he was clearly very, very focused. He was not a frivolous guy. He wasn't there to make friends. He wasn't there to influence our opinions. He wasn't there to do anything but be effective in opposition to the war. And he was so adult and so single-minded that we were. I was impressed, and we signed up immediately. And we decided that what we'd try to do is participate in a. So this was like January. And so they said, well, after we signed up, we started talking to them, and we sent a guy to New York for their meetings, and they said, well, we should do something, anti-war protest in D.C. We decided that was what we wanted to do in April. So this is April 1970. This may be April 71. So we helped organize a Massachusetts contingent to go to Washington to protest the war in a demonstration called Dewey Canyon 3. There were 2 Dewey Canyon operations in Vietnam and Cambodia, and there were secret operations that went into Cambodia and did other various things. We discovered these things because veterans who had participated in them came into our office and talked about them. So they called it Dewey Canyon 3. It was we had some guys who had come by our office, and we contacted them and let them know that this demonstrator invited them, said we'd make a reservation, the bus reservations and so on for them, or hire a bus or do whatever, figure out their transportation, and we told them what to bring and so on if they wanted to go. And we also put an advertisement in the paper, in one of the underground papers with the Phoenix, the real paper, I think, probably both. And we put just a little thing, Operation Dewey Canyon 3, call this number. And it was reverse, so it was black with white letters. And it stood out. And it was that's all it was. And we got hundreds of calls. And so we got enough calls. So we ordered 3 buses, I think, and a train. I ordered a train. But I canceled the train because we didn't have that kind of response. But I think we did send 3 buses, 2 or 3 buses, full of guys to Washington. And then, of course, a lot of fellows drove. I drove myself. So we had raised money to pay for that. And so we spent 4 or 5 days in Washington speaking with the Congress people and having some rallies around the Capitol, expressing our views. And so journalists came to interview us, and we went to the Capitol and talked to our Congress people, and we felt it was effective, and felt it was good work, and that and the more time I spent around these veterans, the more I was convinced that their sacrifices had been were not that they had that there's inequality in sacrifice around war. I suppose that's always the case, but that this inequality was so great for Vietnam that the inequality of sacrifice, the amount of sacrifice that certain people had to make, and where others felt no discomfort at all and felt no responsibility for the sacrifice that the veteran had made, was so great that it was became horrible to me. So I started to think more and more about it, and the justification for it escaped me. I mean, I know that the official justification was that we were fighting communism, but my impression was that Vietnamese people had, they barely had AK-47s. They had, they had antiquated weapons, and they were 6,000 miles away with no means of transportation. Why we had to go to fight them was not justified. I didn't feel it was justified at all. And so those sacrifices, all those guys I lugged around, all those guys that had been in Vietnam Veterans Against the War who were, paraplegic, quadriplegic, had burns, had psychic and physical injuries, I felt that was just wasted. And it was a hard thing to come to terms with. It's a bitter notion, and disillusionment is on that level can be painful. So I, lived that for several years, and I think that sort of trying to figure out what that meant, and trying to figure out how that. I actually studied philosophy to try to figure out the difference between good and bad, which sounds a little stupid, but I started out trying to figure out something.
It doesn't sound stupid. I mean, that's what philosophy is supposed to be, classical, right?
Well, I mean, good and bad, it seems a little simple. Not stupid. Stupid is maybe the wrong word, but good and bad, you think it's innate. That people know that, but I didn't know that. I didn't know, and it seemed to me it was worth, inquiry. It was appropriate. So I started thinking about, I was raised Catholic, so sin and responsibility and guilt, these things are important notions in Catholicism as they are in philosophy. And so I wanted to figure out what, something about ontology, and then I wanted to had a study in virtue. I wanted to study virtue a bit because I thought and I also wanted I was having an inquiry in sin. I had an interest in discerning more about what sin and guilt and responsibility were and how they affected you and how you assigned them to yourself or didn't. So I ended up with I studied some Reinhold Niebuhr, who was a modern philosopher, a contemporary philosopher, was a interesting guy and Protestant theologian, really. And he wrote a book called Moral Man and His Immoral Communities. And so it shaped my thinking a bit about this. And I studied, so I studied other philosophers I learned that there was a lot of useful questions. I didn't learn any answers. At least I don't think I have any answers. But I think I was blessed. I needed to have 4 years to think about the 4 years or 6 years or 7, 8 years that had preceded my experience at Brandeis. I needed to think very deeply, and I needed plenty of time to think and plenty of space to think, and I needed some guidance. And Brandeis gave those things to me for 4 years, and it really changed the direction of my life in a very, very profound and interesting way. I'm extremely grateful for the philosophy department there and for the people who helped me, because perspective is all you really have. It changes everything, and to be able to ask these questions and deal with this stuff and be able to, I think, in a way, it enabled me to rebel against the war in Vietnam, to oppose it, to dissent, and to dissent with logic, to dissent not just emotionally that this is wrong, but why it's wrong, how it's wrong, and what my responsibility was. And so that's a liberating thing. That's the only thing that liberates you, I think, is being able to think your way out of problems. And I was pretty deeply in a problem, and they helped me. And so I became so involved in this type of thought that I imposed silence on myself. I was always interested in religion and interested in Jesuit training and so on. I know that they, at one time, I don't think they do it anymore, they had 2 years of silence and meditation was assigned to each Jesuit academic. And I decided, I actually looked around at Brandeis. I wasn't really talking to anybody. I was just studying, and I would talk when I wanted to order a hamburger, but that was about it. So I decided I wasn't going to talk at all. So I didn't talk for a week or so, and I found it surprisingly easy and liberating, actually, that I wasn't expecting myself to answer a question. I was having trouble figuring out what I thought about things. I wanted to escape superficial interactions, and so that week was pretty good. I thought, well, that worked pretty well. So then I tried for a month. And I stretched it beyond about the 40 days, but it was quite easy. It was easier than you could imagine. Not speaking to anyone for 40 days was painless and easy, but I developed such a profoundly active internal conversation that I actually became afraid that I might never talk to anybody again if I didn't break the spell of this thing, because I was making a lot of progress. Sounds funny now, but it just goes to show how once you get a little a grip on something, and it helps you pull yourself up. That grip becomes tighter and tighter. You can hang on to that like a lifeline, and everything else becomes obscure by that. So that's what happened. And I found it very, hard actually to enter into conversations. I mean, for the first week, had to shut my brain off and just respond. And try to talk about sports or something. You know what I mean? To rejoin civil society.